Perfect. All right, so we're here with a bunch of awesome people, and we're going to be talking about incentivized testnets, learnings from past competition winners, since, as you know, there's a lot of different iterations of game of stakes happening right now. And since you guys are all interested in running validators, it'd be good to learn from what has been done and see what you can do. So I'll let the speakers take it from here.
Cool. My name's Zaki. I'm head of research at Tendermint. Sort of created and executed the first incentivized proof of stake testnet. And I have Adrian here. You want to introduce yourself, Adrian?
Hi, I'm Adrian. I'm one of the founders of CryptiumLabs, a protocol engineering team that happens to run rather large-scale validators at this point.
Yep.
And very early on, I started setting up the first decentralized testnets within Cosmos, where you had 3 people try to be on a Zoom call and get the software to work. So that's actually how I got into validation.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you guys have done. Occlusion is my validator, and we are also doing product development and running infrastructure as well. JK?
Yeah. Hi, my name is JK. I'm the operations manager at stake.fish. Sorry, I missed the earlier part. Are we talking about
We're just doing intros.
Yeah, gotcha. So stake.fish is a professional validator. We're a validator on multi-networks. It's been founded by Wang Chun, who co-founded F2 Pool, one of the biggest mining pools of Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so wanting to do something similar in the proof of stake space, that's how stake.fish got conceived. And I joined in on this vision of trying to create an infrastructure layer for proof of stake projects. Cool.
So we're about a year in. All 3 of us participated in the original game of stakes. We're OG validators. We're about a year in from game of stakes, and we're seeing half a dozen networks, maybe more, running incentivized testnets right now. So I certainly have lots of opinions on this topic, and there are.
I think we all do.
Yeah, but so I guess the first question is, why do you think so many protocols have gone the route of game of stakes? Why do you think this model has become so dominant? And sort of what? Sure, I think that's a good place to start.
I think it's a lot of historic path dependence. It seems to have worked for sort of the one of the very first networks with Cosmos. And Cosmos arguably it attracted a very strong validator set. In the sense that Cosmos, I think overall in the proof of stake space has one of the best validator sets in the world right now. And I think a lot of other networks are trying to replicate this. Whether game of stakes is a good way to do this is a completely different question, because I think just doing game of stakes.
Let's come back to that. I want to start with motivation.
Yeah. For me, I think there are many reasons, but the biggest reason is because you could bootstrap a network, basically. You train the validator sets, you give them incentive to train as well for the mainnet. And then on top of that, you give them tokens such that they're able to make it into the active validator set once the mainnet goes live. So I think the bootstrapping the network is the biggest part of running them.
At this point, you're effectively paying validators to pay attention to you, right? Because all of us have tons of things to do, and there are about sort of 20 networks right now that you could potentially be looking into. And at some point, you need to have some amount of pre-filtering criteria, which is, if I'm going to spend my time here, is this actually going to be worth anything later on?
Yeah.
Also for myself.
I think it's interesting, and it's worth sort of really pointing out and putting a fine point on it. The motivation for doing game of stakes for Cosmos is very different from the motivation of doing doing these incentivized testnets now.
Yeah.
In Cosmos, we already had the validator community before the idea of incentivized testnets was even really floated. And it was almost 6 months from when I had the idea and somewhat prematurely sort of started talking about it to like we were ready to execute on it. And I don't necessarily think a huge number of people. I think the biggest thing though was it was about because we were going to launch with transfers disabled. It was really about sort of creating that initial set of people who could actually like run on the network and participate in Genesis.
When did the Game of Stakes launch again in Cosmos?
So the actual launch of Game of Stakes was the first week of January 2019.
Okay, this was exactly 1 year after I did the well, it's slightly longer than a year after I did the first decentralized testnet setup on Zoom. I think we did the first one there on the 7th of December 2018. And like for the longest period, we had like 20 validators that got jack shit for doing this. Just to test the software and seeing if this actually works. Like this is very important highlight. I agree with Zaki that like Game of Stakes did not create the Cosmos validator set. It sort of gave a bunch of people actual tokens because it didn't have any before.
Well, it definitely did grow it, right? Significantly.
I think if no one who won Game of Stakes started participating like during Game of Stakes or like even in the immediate run up. But it solved a problem that a lot of people were having, which is I've been participating in your test nets. How do I participate at launch? No one will be able to buy tokens, etc.
Yeah. I don't have a single Genesis atom.
And that was really, I think, a big part of the problem that we solved. The other problem that we solved, which we did see new behaviors in Game of Stakes for validators that had not appeared on any of the testnets before.
Yes, it's actually an interesting conversation I had with some other networks last week, which is Game of Stakes a good place to incentivize malicious behavior, sort of to do protocol testing for you effectively? Again, it depends, I think. Like in the Cosmos case, it worked fairly well. It was because we had a bunch of people that knew the software in and out, running validators and like trying to build exploit strategies. I think on most of the newer networks, so the incentivized testnets, no one is going to look into the underlying protocols and try to reverse engineer what works and what doesn't work. Like for that, it's just a lot. Like if you're starting in a fresh network right now and trying to figure this out, it's tons of work.
Adrian, do you think that way it's because there's just too many right now going on?
I think Cosmos hit this like strange sweet spot where you had a bunch of people that already knew the software that at that point decided to start all these like early protocol validation companies. This is where CryptiumLabs got started, right? We didn't start with validation and then went into consensus. We started with consensus. And then like after we knew the software, we built a validator around the same for Zaki's with inclusion. For a bunch of other early Cosmos validators also applies. And this isn't the case anymore. Like we aren't validating new cipher and then we're launching a testnet. It's more that like, to like get on the testnet, we're calling it an incentivized testnet, and now people start validate. Like just want to have it incentivized in order to make money of it and like not waste their time with it.
Okay, so I have two. Well, we'll go down one direction, which is basically how many incentivized testnets are you guys doing right now?
4 or 5, maybe 4.
I think we're doing 3.
I think we're at 8.
Yeah.
7. 8.
I didn't see it.
So, what are you guys seeing on those testnets? Are you seeing people who really know the protocol inside and out? Are you seeing mostly professional validators coming in and having like a sort of superficial understanding?
To me,
I mean,
it's,
actually, go ahead.
Okay.
Because I think we have a different opinion.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I've seen, I'm not seeing like any sort of novel, interesting protocol layer attacks on these testnets. It's mostly validation companies that are starting to figure out how their keys work, how they're automating the infrastructure, how to run these nodes, what the sort of like standard bugs are, because all of these protocols are buggy as hell. All the node software is buggy as hell. So like, do I have to restart these things every 24 hours because they run out of memory otherwise because of memory leak?
Yeah.
These sorts of things. It's more that like
DevOps.
Yeah, figuring out operationally, how do I run this thing? Not what are the underlying protocol faults that can be exploited?
Yeah.
I mean, I think really you're seeing new validators arise on some of them, on some of the incentivized testnets. Like for example, for CeeLo, if you look at the ranking there, like you don't, I mean, at least they're not like the Cosmos validators that we've seen. They're not the professional validators that we've seen before. And I know some of these guys like really contribute to the protocol code base. So like there are definitely upcoming validator teams that are like very invested in one protocol and trying to build their reputation off of that. But it's just that it's Cosmos had the benefit of like being the first and like just got so much attention that I think you've seen a lot more validators sort of spawn off there. But I think we'll see like definitely 2-3 of such like validators really digging into the code base and really creating protocol layer level attacks rising up from each protocol. I do think so.
I guess I would definitely say that like I'm trying to figure out what I'm looking for from like I'm not as directly involved with the team that's running with the people who, with like Chella, who mostly is running most of our incentivized testnets as much. But like when we talk, what I'm actually trying to figure out is whose code is actually mature enough that it's worth like actually learning how the protocol works.
Ooh.
Yeah. I mean, you had the case of Nia, right? Like where let's start stake wars, and then after like 3 weeks, we figured out as a group that like the software just doesn't really work yet that well.
I mean,
and now we'll postpone it.
I made this mistake, right? Like with Game of Stakes.
Oh,
I made this mistake. You know, I was pushing too hard. QA I didn't really figure out how to QA the software until after Christmas, basically. It was like between Christmas and New Year's that like all the pieces of the sort of QA plan that actually got us to mainnet sort of had come together. But I you know, usually when teams ask like what have I learned from Game of Stakes, I'm like, don't do that. Like your incentivized testnet is not part of your QA flow.
Yeah. Otherwise you just have a really expensive QA flow. And a bunch of people will be really annoyed at you for doing it.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing that I've noticed with regards to what you mentioned with Cello, by the way, Zaki, you're on my left and JK, you're on my right, that's what I'm pointing, is that validator community seems to be very separate, actually. So like Cello may have its own validator community. Tezos certainly has a completely separate validator set from most of the major Cosmos validators. Kusama and Polkadot will look somewhat similar to this as well. Like there are only a handful of validators that are large on all networks at the same time. But to some large extent, like these ecosystems separated into their own validator ecosystems as well.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
I did not expect this to happen in the beginning, though. And in the beginning, I sort of expected there would be a global validator set that people would compete for. Not that every individual community would start bootstrapping its own validator set. It's quite nice to see, I have to say.
Zaki, are you saying it's a good thing in terms of security, just because they're all independent of each other?
Well, it's a good thing to have. I think it's good to have sort of better incentive alignment between like here's the problem. One of the things that I view as like a real risk of Game of Stakes, and it was a success because we had this really broad validator set which launched the Cosmos Hub, and it gave a lot of people opportunity to kind of jump in. But exchange, this market is moving. Exchanges and custodians are much bigger players in the validation game than they were a year ago. I think regulatory approval to offer staking products in the US happened like way faster than I would have anticipated. And so, you know, I think already like sort of indie validators are having trouble competing. But if to the extent that any indie validators are going to be able to compete in this market, it's going to be because they're like protocol specialists.
Yeah.
But my statement did not imply that these independent validator communities are protocol specialists.
No.
Most people aren't. Like, depending on the network, some have more protocol specialists, some have less. But most of the validators.
What you mean by protocol specialists is like what Cryptium has, and which is like people who actually work on the core protocol. What I mean are just people who know the ecosystem, know the protocol, know the software really well. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
But it's unclear even if that is a meaningful competitive moat.
Yeah. It's yet unclear to me whether validation will make too much money, like in the long term. In the long term, maybe. In the short term.
I think that's a discussion point for the next panel, right?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, let's kind of go in a I want to talk about a different direction, which is, so one of the things that I think Cosmos had very nicely is there was a really strong intent of a large number of the fundraiser participants to run validators. I don't, you know, a lot of these protocols that are launching now have basically heavily, you know, venture capitalist institutional based token distributions who, and while I think a lot of VCs have intent of setting up something like Polychain Labs, I haven't yet seen those appear as much. And a lot of them are running white labeled on a staking as a service provider, rather than, you know, actually having spun up their own teams. How do you think this just like think about how like this affects token distribution, and like how much, you know, incentivized testnets can push back against having this problem of sort of an overly institutional token distribution?
I think practically speaking, a lot. It depends. So either networks are very shy to share anything about how these tokens are valued or how they're distributed and sort of which VCs hold how much. But like, unless you're plowing 30% of your token distribution into an incentivized testnet, like you're not meaningfully decentralizing or distributing tokens. Like if you're giving out individually 0.5% to people and overall you're giving like 5 to 10% to people, you still have 90% held by the VCs. So I think so far no one has been brave enough to really like put money behind incentivized testnets. Maybe this will also change in the future. We'll see.
Yeah, definitely largely agree with Adrian here. You know, Coda, what their incentivized testnet, like their Genesis program distributes 6.6% across 10,000 people. And like that's a drop in the bucket. They're not going to make a huge dent in like how the coins are going to be allocated on Genesis. It'll be definitely biased towards institutions. But like from our point of view, it's like it's still meaningful in that like you're still giving a chance for these independent or these savvy validators to like rise up. And I think that's good enough because eventually some of these might be plugged into these fund teams that actually spin up their own validator operations in the future. Or, you know, it might be outsourced to these validators. Who knows?
Another, I think, so a lot of the problems in the crypto space come from the idea that like teams try to get a very long tail, where they try to like have thousands of people get small amounts. But what you probably really want is you want to give 50 to 100 people like a medium amount. So if you give 6% to, let's say, 20 people, that'd be very useful. And that's probably better for your network in the long term than trying to get a tiny amount to 1,000 people. Like we see this with regards to how foundations fund things, but also, and it's the same problem. Like you want like 3-4 good projects instead of having sort of 500 tiny things go on in your ecosystem, I think.
I guess there's a huge perception risk though, right? Because there's a whole lot of conversation around decentralization and that it's probably not sufficiently decentralized then.
The problem is like having 1,000 people looks really cool on paper. If it's stake weighted, it's really irrelevant though.
I'm with you, but I think protocols are just hesitant, right? Like I think protocols would love a more professional set and just like keep it that way, at least at the beginning stages. But they also realize this is going to be very, very bad. Like there's going to be a lot of backlash in the community.
Yeah. I don't, it's an interesting question, like how permissionless these validator sets end up being in practice. You know, so far it's mostly been in what churn we've seen in the Cosmos validator set has been heavily tied to like individual whales sort of moving their allocation. What are you seeing about this, Adrian?
Validation is extremely sticky. So something like Tezos, the distribution isn't really going to change massively, I think. This is sort of what we ended up with. This is who holds the tokens, and this is how they're delegated. In Cosmos, this sometimes still happens, but even there, the validator has become rather static. In the sense, like the top 30 or so are sort of figured out at this point. Maybe there's churn at the long tail, but it's very unlikely to me that this is one of the problems where unless as a validation company you decide to launch very early on network and sort of rise with the network, coming in late is like you're fighting a massive uphill battle, at which point it's probably better and more economic to focus on a new network that launches instead of trying to win over delegation on old network.
JK?
Well, Adrian, just a quick question, because on that point, Adrian, when you said about like the Tezos bakers, because we've seen a lot of bakers exit operations, top ones too.
Yes, that is true.
And like I'm while largely I do agree with the data points to the fact that these delegations are sticky, I do want to sort of challenge that notion in the long run. When we're talking about a time frame even like past 1 year, just because we've launched our baker, Tezos baker, last July, and this was not like this was not a Genesis. It's like well past Genesis, right? 1 year, more like almost 1 year past.
Yeah.
But still, we were still able to grow our operations pretty drastically and have like the 4th largest delegator counts. Like, I think it's possible, but it's uphill battle.
It's absolutely possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually curious how this hasn't happened on other networks. Like, I haven't seen so high-profile validators quit on other networks due to regulatory concerns. Maybe it's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is very much a digression from this topic, but I do think that it was interesting. It was like the regulators were much more fans of Tezos's reward distribution model before launch, and post Cosmos launch are much more fans of Cosmos's distribution model.
Is it still that? So from what I'm hearing is that regulators are sort of bigger fans of the Tezos staking model, the delegation model, because it doesn't involve risk on the delegators.
I don't know anything about that. I haven't heard anything one way or the other there.
Okay.
I think that's probably less the issue. I think mostly what and this I think touches a little bit on these incentivized testnets is that you do the regulatory area in which they operate is very much a gray area. We did KYC, OFAC, and everything for Cosmos, and most validators are all doing that. It's a very heavy regulatory burden that is being carried to launch these networks.
Yeah.
But how have you guys found we didn't use a vendor. It was like me and Jesse and Michelle pretty much did every one of the KYCs and it was like, it was a nightmare. It took like days and days and days and days.
I'm sorry, Zaki. I'm sorry.
I'm not blaming you. I asked for what happened, and it was worth it.
Oh God.
How has the experience been signing up in a lot of these networks?
From our end, we're seeing people use CoinList a lot, I guess. But still, like, there are other additional documents outside of just doing the simple KYC, which then requires a lot of back and forth email chains, confusion. Honestly, it's a mess. It's definitely a mess.
I mean, it very much depends on the network. So at the one extreme, we have, I think, Solana to me, which is, I'm not suggesting the contracts are bad, but it's just like, it's like 20 to 30 pages worth of contracts. Where you just go like, if I actually have to review this properly and like consider the consequences of this, is the amount of tokens I'm being allocated from the incentivized testnet actually worth it? Like, sure, if you just sign things, that's just fine. But if you actually have to care about what you sign,
generally running Solana testnet infrastructure is expensive.
But it doesn't have to be this way, right? When you look at something like Kusama, Kusama is very lightweight. It required no legal interaction with any other third party. You just sort of run the network. And I think Kusama is actually a very interesting model for incentivized testnets. Like launching almost, because it's at this point, it's not really a testnet. It's like, it will never go away, I think. It's just like a tiny mainnet. That's not super valuable, but it's a good testing ground. But just like, I think at the other extreme of approaches you can take as a network.
JK, are you running on Kusama?
Yeah, we are. But I think the challenge with Kusama is just that on the technical front, just the consistent, the upgrades has been challenging. But yes, other than that, we're running on it, and we're actually seeing.
I actually want to touch on this a little bit more, because a good thing to talk about is just like the experience of updating while incentivized testnet is live, or and how that process is, and I suspect I feel like a lot of this is one of the things that we aren't, for the most part, doing in these testnets is, like, for instance, like, there are no governance votes for upgrades. There's no analysis. It's just like, the centralized entity pushes an update, and I think everyone just sort of sucks it down. Curious about how you guys think about that stuff.
I think it will continue this way, even for most mainnets. Like, the cost of auditing these code bases and understanding what upgrades do is just incredibly high, and no one has yet figured out how to incentivize for this, right? Like, people assume that validators are incentivized to do this, but really they aren't. And like, if they just run the infrastructure, get coins, sell the coins immediately as soon as they receive them, like, they have no incentive to care about the long-term protocol. For that, you require people that are.
This is what having your reputation tied to like one protocol is good at. It does create a stronger incentive. I think the Cosmos hub upgrades have been sort of pretty widely peer reviewed by the validator set before they happen. My impression is I'm seeing less of that on other networks, but I'm curious.
Do you mean the upgrade itself or the upgrade mechanism? Like the protocol that changed to, or the upgrade mechanism?
I think both. I don't know. I wonder if this is a thing that like should be a bigger part of incentivized testnets. Like, a protocol could like hide a back door in one of their testnet upgrades and like reward someone for finding it.
I think no one will find. Like, it's very.
I know, but it would be interesting.
It'd be cool. That's true.
I think so. The other thing that I would say, and like, correct me if you guys think I'm wrong, is I feel like a lot of these incentivized testnets are a lot more orchestrated than Game of Stakes was towards the end.
I think I agree with that assessment.
Like we kind of like made like wanted Game of Stakes, especially like sort of the last week of it, to really be like a kind of like Wild Wild West.
But then there's definitely pros and cons to that, right? Like because people were just unsure of like the reward schemes, like how like people were rewarded on Game of Stakes. There was a lot of confusion on that, what they need to do.
My bad.
No. It's just like, no, but like the upside is, see, right? Like as you mentioned, like you introduce a lot of chaos and people experimenting a whole lot of different stuff. People, I think, some of the protocol teams took that and said like, oh, we'll try to make this more formalized, which is why you see much more orchestrated attempts than just be like all hell break loose, go for it.
Yeah.
I think the only one that comes close to this is Kusama with Polkadot, where it's like super unclear what's happening. Kusama actually reminds me a lot of Game of Stakes, I have to say.
Okay.
It's sort of like super messy. The software is, at least the cycles at which the software is shipped is somewhat faster, and due to that, the software is way more unstable some of the time. Like I'm actually super happy with the Game of Stakes software that we used at the time. At least it like didn't break every 2 days. But yeah.
Yeah. I'm frankly kind of amazed at like the willingness of people to like, it does seem like there's like a good chunk of people that are willing to like put up with like a considerable like more software instability at this phase than I would have expected.
Are you talking about a protocol in particular, or just generally?
Just generally, like people's patience felt like it was wearing pretty thin as I got towards the end of the Cosmos testnet cycle. And we're, as far as I know, like at that point, like orders of magnitude more stable than anything.
So actually,
yeah.
Like
I just wanted, yeah, go ahead, Adrian.
The Polkadot nodes are not per se unstable.
Okay.
They just hit brief periods every 4 weeks of 1 week complete instability because there's zero Q&A, it feels, going into what's being released. It's like someone writes code and it's like, this is now a release, have fun. And all of a sudden it's like, these things just randomly drop out of consensus. They just crash because they're out of memory. CPU just 4x for some reason. No one knows.
So how do you handle that?
So with Kusama,
so like with Game of Stakes, like literally what happened is like people were just not sleeping.
Yeah,
that's true.
Like that's not sustainable. What's happening?
So this is in Kusama. The way this works is mostly that this causes slashes in the system because you're offline, and then there's another upgrade period. A bunch of people go down. People start complaining, and then governance, however decentralized you want to consider that to be, just reverses all the slashes.
Yay.
Oh, so they reverse slashes on in Kusama? Interesting.
Yeah. Otherwise, this would have been completely unfeasible. Because for the longest time, there was a period of 2 weeks where people just kept getting slashed over and over, even if they did everything correctly.
Also, but Zaki, I want to challenge your earlier statement about the fact that you think people are more comfortable with the instability for 2 reasons. One is I think people are less prone to express what they think really, just because some of these validators, especially independent ones, they will rely on foundation delegations eventually. And it's better to be in the good graces and not like try to be too critical. Second part is there's a lot of networks, right? Meaning that your attention span, you could just jump onto another network if you're like, I'm done with this, I'll visit back in a week, maybe it'll be more stable then. And so like there's a lot less like people like thinking like just getting angry and just complaining.
Got it. Interesting.
Should we take? There are like 3 or 4 questions here.
Yeah, we're happy to talk about some of these questions.
What is the most decentralized network you have worked or working with in terms of validation and core development, in your opinion? I think so. Right. This is also because I've built the second core dev team like that ships protocol upgrades and Tezos. I think Tezos is relatively high up there. It's a relatively broad validator set, like beta set, validator set. More and more people start looking into the code base. I think Cosmos is also doing quite well because a lot of other people just know the code base, and so
it's it's a good code base to understand. It's like designed for understandability.
Yeah, it's written in Go. It's like very accessible. So I think Cosmos is doing well in this. I think Polkadot will have real problems with this because it's like written in incomprehensible Rust. Same for Nia, same for Solana, actually. They all have problems with this. In terms of validators, I think Cosmos is also at the top there with regards to decentralization.
We haven't done decentralized dev as much as we could, but we are working on it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to take time, right? Even on Tezos, it took some time for the outside dev teams.
Yeah, I want to go faster, but we'll see.
Like it's mostly, I think, a function of having a governance process that's somewhat structured enough in order to allow other people to contribute. Because otherwise, it's very hard for a team to jump in and go like, well, hopefully there is a process by which my thing goes through, but we will see.
Yeah.
This also comes down to also like the upside.
I'm tremendously curious about Kusama, but I don't have like any appetite to actually run nodes.
Well, I'm running 32 of them.
Yeah. How's that? They're also running this experiment that we were like unwilling to do for Cosmos, which is like we think that like you're doing what we said would happen, which is like if you just like try and like force decentralization on the validator set, like Cryptium will run 30 nodes.
The funniest thing is people started accusing me in the beginning of like, you're clearly attacking the protocol. I was like, no, I read the protocol. This was designed this way. You're not doing this correctly. But no one else except Stake. So Stake has now hired a guy that spun up 20 nodes for them, it seems.
That's fascinating.
Yep, Stake and Cryptium are the top two ones.
Yeah. And like, if all our nodes are in, we're running like 25% of the network, which they generally are. Like I'm thinking of starting another cluster of 16 nodes. So running 4.
And I forgot it was me or like someone actually specifically asked during one of these validator like AMAs, like, are we allowed to run multiple validators? And like the answer was clearly yes.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think Cryptium and Stake are probably the two that has been able to do this at scale, and you guys have been preparing for it well in advance. And just to answer the earlier question, I think that Adrian answered. I think someone's asking for Zaki, you, and me's our opinion as well on like the most decentralized network that we're working with. I largely, I think, agree with Adrian on Tezos and Cosmos, and I think that shows in sort of the market's perception as well, that they're relatively the more mature proof of stake networks, really making progress, and the validator set is pretty at this point stable.
So what I'm going to say is, so I'll just like actually caveat that a little bit more. One is the Tezos Foundation has been very good about funding and spinning up multiple dev teams. So far, though, I expect to hear more along these lines in 2020. The Interchain Foundation has not been as aggressive with spinning up sort of as much overlapping Cosmos dev teams, though we've had teams that have been working on sub protocols and stuff like this, but it all really requires IBC to pull all of these pieces together. And there's basically just like the Agoric team, the Tendermint team working on IBC for the most part. The other good thing, though, that has been about Cosmos is in my opinion, is the fact that so many people use the software to run networks other than the Cosmos hub. And that has an effect of diversifying the dev pool quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like people using Tendermint Core under the hood. I mean,
using the Cosmos CK, using Tendermint Core under the hood has broadened the developer ecosystem enormously. I strongly suspect that if like, the Cosmos core team was all struck by a meteorite or something like that. One of these other teams would probably just see it as being in their interest to step in.
Yep.
Yeah, I basically think only Tezos and Cosmos have the ability to, like, if one sort of hierarchical organization of developers actually, like, the boat trip sinks on the team retreat, actually, like, have, like, enough diversification to actually pick up the pieces right now.
Yeah, I really like that point. I might use it in the future as well.
We should introduce it as the metric. If your boat sinks, does your network sync with you?
Yeah. There's always a boat. Like, there's, like, my experience with Cosmos, at least, and, like, a number of other protocols, is you eventually get everyone on a boat.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah, what was it? One of those
It's happened many times.
Yeah. Well,
Also, you get a bunch of people flown to the same location for a conference.
Yeah.
It's like,
So
Operationally
there are
probably not the
multiple
best
teams,
idea.
there are multiple retreats. There's a lot of people who know how the system works. It's good. I hope somebody would feel it was in their interest to step in the event that anything happens to us.
another interesting question here, maybe. How can we make validators at the bottom of the list be operationally sound to a point where it continues its operations?
I have no freaking clue how to solve this problem. And this is related to the topic here, because this is what happens. You do this incentivized testnet, and you largely create this group of validators that are, like, at the margins of economically, and essentially the entire sort of AUM of proof of stake right now is largely too small to support that many validator operations.
I mean, like, practically speaking, in terms of basic math, you're talking 1% of AUM, right? 10% average network inflation, 10% average commission rate, 1% of assets under management over Ether. And that's not a lot, because unless you have, like, massive amounts of stake. I think what Celo is doing could be interesting, because Celo also rewards node operators individually, but it doesn't seem that Celo allows for this splitting across many different keys the same way Kusama does. But it requires, like, I think centralized networks will have an easier time making the bottom tier operator or the bottom list operators more economically stable, because they can have other civil protection mechanisms, and then they can pay each node operator individually sort of a base fee. But doing this in a complete decentralized fashion is really hard.
This is what I think is really the point, and, like, there's some discussion about this on the in the Cosmos community today, which is, this is the trade-off between permissionlessness and, like, having, like, a decentralized validator set. Is if there is some entity that chooses and permissions entities into the thing, or a small group of entities, yeah, then you can, like, have a planned economy. Where you're like, like, there's guaranteed validator income, basically. And if you are trying to run the experiment of a perfectly permissionless system, you can't, and stake.fish and Binance and Coinbase will all press their advantages, and we got to live in that battlefield.
An interesting incentivized testing question, maybe.
Giving up on the AirPods. No, now you're Darth Vader echoey voice. I think you're probably mic through the
gotta have some entertainment.
Now Adrian is gone all pixelated. I don't know what's going on. Can you go on?
Adrian,
Okay.
Okay. we lost Adrian. Oh, there he
Okay.
is.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect.
You're human again.
Sorry about that. AirPods power doesn't have particular login fields. What were you talking about beforehand?
Incentivizing like the smaller validators. There was something, Adrian, you wanted to lead. I think you were saying like you were going along the lines of it made me think.
I forgot. We can come back to this.
Yeah, it's a challenge. There's no answer. I think everyone is experimenting at this point. I don't think anyone has come up with the golden answer yet. And maybe it just stays this way. And maybe we just need.
I mean, one of the things that I'm worried a little bit about is like everybody is playing around with economics, but especially like when you get outside of the Tezos, Cosmos, and Polkadot distributions, like it becomes super institutionally focused, and it's like not really clear to me that like we're going to be able to learn very much from like economics of some of these alternate protocols, especially unless somebody like runs near with a hard spooned atom distribution or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
I'm like super excited about that being a thing. I'm super excited about cross fertilizations between token distributions and software.
I agree. I think if I were to launch a network right now, I'd probably hard spoon 3 or 4 distributions and make it claimable on the new chain at some fixed conversion rate. Because everything else, because like if you are something like Neo or Solana, if you sell 80 or Definitive for that matter, like 80% of your tokens are owned by like 5 companies in SF. This will never meaningfully change. At least I don't see how, unless you're just willing to give early investors a massive upside and then they exit out of the project and dump on retail. But that doesn't seem like a good model. So
that just means that Binance now runs all your nodes.
Yeah,
exactly.
This sort of goes into another question here. Are validators concerned about major exchanges offering more staking services and outcompeting validators themselves?
Oh, I've got so much to say.
Do it. Go.
Yeah.
But like it all concludes down to like we're not concerned. Like this was always going to be a factor. Like the staking amount that exchanges hold right now was never going to be up for competition amongst the validators. Period. It was always going to be like this. There were multiple blog posts, multiple analyses way beforehand expecting this. And I believe that, like correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys both are planning like around this. You guys fully expected this. It shouldn't come as a surprise.
I think both Cryptium and Occlusion, like the staking operations for the 2019 was like a bootstrapping towards like differentiated business models. I think in general, I tend to think that the right staking business model is either you go at scale like stake.fish or Bison Trails, etc., or it's like staking plus another business.
Yeah, and like I'm being upfront. Like for us, even we're not going to constantly rely on staking, commission rewards forever. Like we're definitely exploring and we're launching different services and products on top of staking, because the commissions is not just the pure play is not the way to go.
I was, though, frankly, and who knows whether or not people will like me for poking this bear, expecting to see more concern from compliance teams in exchanges about like offering staking and trading derivatives.
I did not expect this actually. I think exchanges are by far the dodgiest people in this ecosystem. And like they've had to deal with the regulatory uncertainty the most. And due to that, I think like someone like Binance, like them offering staking derivatives is probably one of the less dodgy things they've done so far. So I think they probably feel very comfortable with it.
Sure.
I don't like. I think it fundamentally comes down to who holds your tokens and what your token holders want to do, right? Like I can't force people that hold their own private keys to like delegate to me or delegate or move their money to an exchange and stake with them. And like, if you're a small holder, I can totally see why you want to make the choice to like not custody your own funds. However, if a large percentage of your network has this mentality, your network will just be run by exchanges. This is actually my biggest worry for newer projects like near Solana, because a bunch of VCs hold these tokens. These VCs aren't going to figure out how to delegate them. They will put them into Anchorage, Coinbase custody, and go like, cool, I'm now liquid and I can trade, and I don't have to worry about where my keys are. And because right, it's like not the model that VCs are built for. VCs aren't custodians that like want to hold large sums of gold in their own house to like portion it out to validators on the network.
But then, the markets will do its thing, right? Adrian, you made this point that like if a network is not like sufficiently decentralized, at least, or at least the market does not perceive it that way, there's no real value to it. And so, the funds will likely correct their behaviors well before that to make sure, at the very least, there's some, perception of decentralization.
I don't know. The problem to me is that like the market adjustment mechanism to valuing these assets fundamentally currently doesn't work. Like currently we have a bunch of things that are valued even though they fundamentally don't work. And they're valued very highly. So it doesn't seem that the market really cares about functionality or technicalities. And at least in the short term, not in the long term necessarily. So I think in the short term, what can happen is that VCs delegate to Coinbase custody, Coinbase stakes with them, 5 exchanges run these networks. In 2 years, still no one cares, but all the lockup periods are gone. They slowly exit out of their positions. And then you see what happens. Then we'll see what happens. But I think the market correction mechanism takes too long for this to like meaningfully pressure VCs into like decentralizing these networks.
Sure, but at the very least, you'll see like demand for the protocol, like increasing in the decrease. Like, applications are not going to build on a network that's run by 5 exchanges. They simply won't. That's not why they built up their applications.
Yeah.
Are either of you guys running on Tron or EOS?
EOS, yes. But like we're well out of the candidate, even the candidate range right now. It's a very different playground there.
Yeah, those are very. My impression is it's extremely exchange concentrated. I'm curious. I think one of the things that has is the 21-day lockup has at least kept the reality with like exchanges have been a little bit more conservative about how much they stake, etc. It's not going to last forever.
But you're right. The lockup period is one thing they'll need to consider. They'll also need to consider the withdrawals, amounts that they see daily on a daily basis. For security reasons, also they might choose not to keep their wallets on a staking wallet. I think there are challenges that exchanges are addressing right now, such that the one thing is I don't expect the staking reward rates on exchanges to be as high as some of the validators. So I think that's one thing that's going for validators at the moment. Really?
I'm expecting that all exchanges will run at 0 fees, because staking is not their business model. It doesn't have to make the money. As the business model, if I'm Coinbase, I'm caring about attracting more people to my platform so they trade and spend money on trading fees. And this is specifically true for Binance, actually.
Yeah, I'm not disputing the 0% fees, but I think they'll be doing fractional staking, which would then
fractional staking.
If they've got 100, if they got customer deposits of 100K or something, they're not going to stake that entire amount. They need to set aside a certain amount for withdrawals, which would decrease the effective staking reward rate that drops to each user.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. That's also, exchanges are very good liquidity management.
Yeah. Interestingly, I don't think we see any exchanges doing incentivized testnets.
They don't really there's no incentive for them to.
Yeah. It's
So I have to say
think that dynamic is interesting. Is it like you see
like,
some of the investors in the funds starting to participate in like the test nets for their projects. A16Z is on the Celo testnet.
But even for those, some of them are just being, they're being contracted off, right?
Yeah. Almost all of it's being contracted.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm not aware of another team like Polychain Labs yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Incentivized testnets are funky in that sense.
This is a good question and somewhat relevant to the incentivized testnet. I think one of the things that has been frustrating for me is how many teams like distribute their software in a way that like assumes you'll be running on AWS. This like AWS GCP bias, and like we definitely struggle with that because like Occlusion likes to be able to really control our software supply chain, where we run our stuff. Like we want control over that, and we are not happy.
Very similar for us. Like a lot of teams ship things only in Docker by default, and making the bare metal builds work is a pain in the ass because it's poorly documented. But we hold the opinion that like I don't want to have more things in my supply chain and run like individual servers for each network, like for each of these networks. And makes it a real pain. But I also understand because it's a trade-off, right? They want to get as many people running these things as possible, and then having a single Docker setup script is super convenient. It depends what you optimize for. Do you optimize for sort of like 10, 20, 50 high-quality validators, or do you optimize for having 500 validators, each one of them who spend $5 on like setting up VPS somewhere, and just clicks go, and hopefully this never breaks.
Yeah, which all loops back to the point of like, how do you then bring up, like, how do you make sure that the small validators are sustainable? And you don't want to create, I think, a technological barrier on top of the financial barriers. It's understandable where they're coming from, but
I also think it's just like a little bit unclear, frankly, like what validators are securing right now.
Oh yeah.
Like
what?
I think they do a good job. They're like securing, like they're protecting liveness pretty good. Like liveness is a big part of what validators are doing right now. When we started out with Cosmos and and this idea of running like permissionless Tendermint, there was a lot of skepticism that like liveness would actually happen. And I think we're in a good place in the ecosystem where like people are working really hard, are doing a lot of really good work on liveness in general in our ecosystems. And I think these incentivized testnets are actually really good for training people on that side.
Yeah.
But like attacking these things right now is pointless for the most part.
Because they secure nothing valuable.
Yeah.
I'm still surprised that no one has attacked Tron. Because Tron has gambling dApps. I don't expect that they have secure randomness in protocol. I'm expecting that if you can run Tron validators and start fucking with gambling dApps on Tron, you actually may be able to make money on this.
I thought that I don't know what the status of like the proposed Kyber EOS Ethereum bridge was, but if that thing comes online, it would actually be like pretty interesting to run attacks as an EOS validator.
yeah, I thought there was an attack, wasn't there, on Tron?
Really?
Possibly.
Yeah,
There was something, yeah. But the question, yeah, it's a very good question. What are we securing? What are any of these things used for? Because as far as I can tell, not for a lot. Like there's very little actual real world things that these networks currently solve. Which means that we are sort of securing future magical money that may or not work.
I think Tesmos and the Cosmos Hub are like meaningful coordination mechanisms at this point.
Yeah.
Like they are good giant DAOs.
But even that, it's still fairly self-referential to me. Like there hasn't been a single use case that these things solve that is external to the system.
Sure.
Like all the coordination is about the system itself. At some point, the system needs to like do something useful, though.
Yeah, I agreed.
I mean, the topic is just becoming so broad at this point. Then, right? It's just like, I mean, are the valuations even justified on any of these networks? Then, like, there's just a whole host of questions that you're knocking on by asking that.
Yeah, I don't think we need. There was this question about pure proof of stake versus delegation. I have really strong opinions about this.
Are we talking about like Algorand? I think specifically.
No, that was,
Or
I
just like
honestly have no idea how Algorand is working right now. Every time I try and look into it, I get confused. Do you know? What is pure proof of stake?
There's really no there's actually really no strong incentives for someone to run a node.
On Algorand?
Yeah, like you could be staking, but you don't need to like run a node to like be staking.
Yeah, that's my understanding of the Algorand
Wait,
system.
what? So what are you doing at that
like you're
point?
signaling the fact that you're.
Yeah, like you have a public key. The public key is staked. There's some amount, and like it's getting staking rewards. But because like Algorand works on this like random subcommittee selection, and if a subcommittee is not live, then it just selects a new subcommittee until its subcommittees are live.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not cool, but seems strange. But okay, pure proof of stake means no central validators, but you can also have delegation of stake in a trustless manner.
I think if we could rephrase the question to like, what are our opinions, I guess, about like a delegatable network versus non-delegatable? Maybe that's much a better question just to like answer.
Quantum is the big non-delegatable network.
I haven't looked into Quantum. So like you don't need to delegate at all, and you need
can't
to
delegate at all. And it's interesting that validators as a service has existed for that like long before any of us launched our businesses. Right.
The masternode system, I see.
Yeah. Like any of these systems, like delegation is just a form of encumbered loan. So loans naturally exist. And it's just like a question of like, do you want to like have the regulatory overhead of having all of this stuff be off chain, or do you want to put some of it on chain and put it in the state?
I mean, this is what I currently really prefer about Cosmos and Kusama, that you have slashable delegation in protocol, right? Like someone delegates to me and now their delegation is slashable. In Tezos, this doesn't exist, so people have to model this with off-chain contracts. And it becomes a centralizing point, by the way, because it is hard for people to attract capital if the people that are giving you the capital have to trust you with the principal and have to trust like some weird legal contracts that are not algorithmically enforced. And so like in Tezos, you start seeing this, that a lot of the smaller bakers have real problems accessing capital because they have to convince some large token holders to just send them money effectively and trust that everything will be okay. And so in that sense, I personally very much prefer the model where you have as much of the things that affect the security model in protocol as possible, right? Like the protocol should know about how slashable delegation is handled, like how slashable delegation evolves in the world. It should know about it. It shouldn't move into off-chain contracts. Otherwise, I think you see like it's somewhat centralizing.
So what I'll say, okay, so I think we're gonna wind things down now. Just like sort of last thoughts. I guess my last question is, so it's been a year since Game of Stakes. We see all of these incentivized testnets. Will we see a year from now, will there be more incentivized testnets or fewer incentivized testnets? Predictions. How many incentivized testnets do you think we'll see in 2020?
I think in 2020 we're going to peak.
Okay.
I see that the rate of new networks being launched is somewhat slowing down. because none of these networks have yet really figured out what they are about. So maybe in 2021 this starts picking up again, but that more networks start being developed and start being launched. But right, because sort of the peak in network funding was set like 17, 18, early 19.
17,
and so now those things are coming online, but then 19 there was very little funding, so we'll see a drop off where these networks stop, but we don't have networks that go live anymore. That's my prediction, at least.
For me, definitely the numbers will decrease, at least in the networks we're monitoring. Most of these are bound to launch this year, so less incentivized testnets. I predict that incentivized testnets will be geared more towards the smaller independent validators and no longer for professional ones. And so there'll be much more community-driven sort of attempts to get like hobbyist validators onboarded. And most professional validators will actually like stop participating in incentivized testnets.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah, I sense that like we'll see a lot of things inspired by Game of Stakes in 2020. By 2021, I think the incentivized testnet space may be pretty quiet, and then maybe we may see more interesting stuff in 2022, unless there's like a sort of clear winner from the 2020-2021 timeframe. Cool.
All right. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks. Thank you very much, guys.
Have a nice evening, morning, wherever you are. Thank you for all the listeners.
I love this model. I was
Me
so
too.
happy to participate in this. This is
It's a lot of fun.
getting on the plane and getting coronavirus.
Oh yeah. Have you stocked up on like face masks and food and water?
Oh God.
I'm not that concerned about the virus. I'm concerned about the fear of the virus. So. All right. Thanks, guys. And always good to see you. We have been working together for many years, and it's always a pleasure to hang out.
Indeed.
Thanks.
Hey guys.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I don't know how to end this, so I'm just closing the browser.
Wait, I think I'll text Hissam to take us offline.
Yeah, she told us she was like she told me to go to 10:45. It's 10:45. So I'm also want to go to sleep.
Wait, Zaki, where are you right now?
California.
Gotcha.
I don't know if the live stream. I assume the live stream.
If all of us leave, it should stop. Okay, so let's.
Okay.
All right.
Bye bye.